Hello, I'm Cab Daniels. Let's continue reading I Am Gypsy. The conclusion today, Chapter 9, Wednesday. The wind blew all night and was steadily getting stronger. But it wasn't bad when the sun finally came up the next morning. It was blowing around 40 knots, but I'd seen that much wind in the Caribbean. I still didn't know what to expect, and Cappy was unusually quiet. He checked and rechecked every inch of me, making sure I was as ready as I could be. He assembled what he'd called a ditch bag. He put in water, food, a telephone, a radio, money, a change of clothes, and bug spray, even though there were no bugs. Even the bugs knew the storm was coming. Cappy tied his ditch bag to the big white fender and then tied the whole thing off to a cleat at my stern. He tied a little slip knot that he could quickly pull loose if he needed. I was in good hands, but that hurricane was getting closer every minute. The sky turned ugly, and I could hear sounds that I'd never heard. Pine trees were swaying and rubbing together, making eerie sounds. The wind howled and the rain began. Alarms and sirens wailed in the distance. The weather radio announced that Hurricane Michael would make landfall near Tyndall Air Force Base as a Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds of 155 miles per hour. The entrance of Pearl Bayou lies on the edge of Tyndall Air Force Base, exactly where we were anchored. Cappy pulled on his foul weather gear and the biggest life jacket I'd ever seen. I didn't even know I had a life jacket like that on board. He wedged himself into a corner of my cockpit and pressed his feet against the gunnel. The sky burst open, and all the wind in the world descended upon us. Walls of water poured from the boiling sky. The air filled trees and water and wind, and it was impossible to see. Cappy was wearing goggles to protect his eyes, but they were useless. The relentless walls of water and wind crushing against us, wave after wave, was unbearable. My anchor chain strained and begged to break, but it would not. The heavy anchor drove itself deeper into the mud and held on with mighty strength. We rolled violently until my mast slapped the water so hard I felt my keel shudder from the force. Cappy was thrown about like a rag doll, his body arching and bending and twisting every time he struck my deck. I could barely hear his agonizing cries over the roaring, rushing wind and relentless water. There was no sky, and there was no sea. It was all the same. Everything I'd known vanished into a howling, liquid chaos. I felt parts of myself fail and fly away, riven by the unimaginable force of the storm. One moment my mast would be underwater to port, or what I believed to be port, and the next second I'd be on my side to starboard. I bucked and lunged against my mooring, but I couldn't break free. If only I could break free and ease the agony of the relentless pull of the chain and the anchor, if only. And then I heard it. It was the chain surrendering under the immeasurable force. I should have been free, and the agony should have soon ended, but it didn't end, and I wasn't free. I was still shackled to the bottom of the bayou. That was to have been my refuge, but had become my hell. What snapped? What did I hear? My question was silenced by a horrible answer. The ketch I had so admired had snapped her mooring and was now crushing herself against my bow. Splinters of every imaginable substance, fiberglass, wood, iron, steel, exploded into the liquid air above my deck. The enormous main mast of the ketch came collapsing like a mighty oak, ripping at my rigging and tearing away what was left of me. The force of the collision with the ketch mercifully ripped me from my mooring and sent me tumbling, keel over mast, mast over keel, until neither remained. As we collided, the body of a man who could have been KH or Thomas or 1,000 others came melting across my deck and pouring into my cockpit with Cappy. The man wore no life jacket and showed no signs of life. Cappy, broken and crawling through death's gaping door, twisted free of his life jacket, and in a desperate, final, selfless act, he tied the jacket to the man's body. Seconds later, they were both swept overboard from what was left of my crumbling, failing deck. The two bodies vanished in the blackened void that had been sky and air, but was now a lifeless chasm of turmoil and chaos. For hours upon hours, the storm raged and howled and annihilated all that had been before it. I succumbed to the force and the rage, as did every other thing, alive or not, within what I had known to be the world around me. Nothing remained as it had been. Everything was slaughtered and trodden and emptied of wholeness, and left broken, bent, and defeated. What remained of me was but splinters and tangled, indistinguishable bits of rubbish and destruction. Cappy was no more. But the man who now wore Cappy's life jacket sat whimpering and gasping against the broken, shattered hull of a boat I'd never seen, resting 100 feet away in a cluster of decimated trees. The man was alive because Cappy had chosen to give his life to save another. That is what humanity should be. And that is what I learned from Cappy. As I succumbed to the forces of the storm that I lacked the strength to overcome, I remember the love I have for my families. I remember how I grew in spirit as I watched them grow, and how I experienced the heartbreaks they endured. I remember the adventures we had and the trials we faced together. I remember how they looked at me the first time they saw me, and how much I treasured their touch and affection. They trusted and loved me, and I adored every one of them. I hope they all know that had it been required of me, I would have lovingly and willingly given my life for any of them. I would have, without hesitation, allowed myself to be torn plank from plank and stem from stern, so they could have one last bit of me to cling to, so that some small piece of me might hold them afloat and the world dissolved around them. No greater honor could I have been given than to be what they needed so desperately when fear overwhelmed them. I would have done so because I loved them, each of them. And as I surrendered now to my wounds, my dying desire for my family is to know that I loved them completely. I was Gypsy.